So you'll see from the title of this presentation, Finding the Right Project, that you're not going to get Diversion 101. We're hoping that all of you who are here, unlike me, are a little bit more familiar with the project. What I do want to talk about is the process that the participants, particularly the city of Fargo, because that's where I'm from, went through to find the right project and define what we thought was the right project. The grandness and the complexity that you see is really something that evolved. It evolved over time as solutions to problems that were presented along the way. So with that in mind, this is the problem. This is the problem that kicked off the study. So this photo was taken in 1997, and it started us in this effort of developing a solution on a grand scale. So if you look here, you can see this is the Red River just south of Fargo Moorhead. You can see the overland flooding that's occurring. The river has spread out. It's taken over sections of land and is moving north toward both cities. So following that flood event, it was Cass County that initiated a flood mitigation study. That flood mitigation study turned into what we called the Southside Flood Control Project. That project was fairly modest. At the time, it seemed huge. We were dealing with about $9.5 million in grant money, in HMGP grant money. And it wasn't until 2002 that that project was turned over to the city of Fargo. I actually came to the world of flood control from traffic engineering in 2006, and I tell you what, if I'd been given a peek ahead, I might still be traffic engineering. But at that time, the city had four alternatives that we were out presenting to the public. And every time we drew a line, and this is the limit, this is where we're going to provide flood protection, it seemed like someone else came to the table and said, what about us? We're just outside of that line. And that project continued to grow. So by 2008, we had 5 alternatives, and we conducted an unbelievable amount of meetings in that year. Close to 60 public meetings about that plan at that time.
More than 1 week.
Some things you need to know about that plan. That plan included levees along the north side of the Wild Rice River. It included what we call drain extensions. You can see those there. Hopefully on the map, I know that the scale is a little bit difficult, but those red dotted lines were extensions of internal legal drain systems to bring them out to the limit of the project and allow water to flow through those limits and get into those drain systems. It included internal storage areas. They were internal because that gave us the opportunity to control when they filled. And we could take advantage of that storage at the peak of the flood when it was most effective for us. It also included a small diversion, which was just south of the Wild Rice River on the outside between the Wild Rice River and the Red River. So diverting the Wild Rice River over to the Red River. And it included something we called channel extensions. Channel extensions, you see the cross-section there just on the bottom of the screen. You see the Red River, and then just adjacent to the Red River, the idea of building a ditch that would add additional conveyance that could be available during times of flooding. That concept of channel extensions, it wasn't a new idea. It's something that the Corps of Engineers actually did when they built levees in downtown Fargo to try and compensate and offset the impacts of those levees. They created a couple of channel extensions in Fargo, one of them on the north side of town near Edgewood. So it was basically taking a concept that we'd already seen applied in our community and expanding it. Without those channel extensions, we would not have been able to achieve a zero net impact for this project. But with those channel extensions, we were. But it was clear when we added those extensions to the project that we needed partners. The extensions, as you see here depicted on these two images, were not only in North Dakota, they had to cross the border into Minnesota. And so we would have needed to work very closely with our other allies and partners along the Red River to accomplish this project. So we were going to need help. And some other things I should point out quickly is that project, the Southside Flood Control Project, was really designed around what we knew. And what we knew at the time is that our impending floodplain change was going to take us to a river gauge of approximately 39.5 feet. That was based on a flow of about 29,300 cubic feet per second. And that was, what we expected to be the largest flood we'd have to deal with. Well, during the midst of going out, talking to the public, presenting that plan, revising that plan based on the feedback from the public, we experienced the 2009 flood. That flood exceeded our design capacity for the project that we had underway. 2009, we had a lot of folks that visited us before that event, leading up to that event, and then following that event. One that's very memorable is Senator Dorgan. He came to town and he said, okay, Fargo, you just went through this devastating flood. What is your plan? How are you planning to protect the residents of Fargo from this type of event? And we were very proud of the work we had done, so we took out the Southside Flood Control Plan and we laid it on the table and said, here's what we've got. And the senator looked at us and shook his head and said, no. Where is your plan for all of Fargo? We had been concentrating on the area of biggest need for Fargo, and with the remap, that looked like it was going to be the area south of Interstate 94. That's where we had the most people going into the floodplain, so that's where we concentrated our efforts. So this idea of planning for the whole city was just, it was mind-blowing. We hadn't done that. And so we hadn't dared to dream that there was a project that was that big that we could accomplish. So as if one paradigm shift during the flood of record isn't enough, as you're trying to recover from a flood, we also experienced two more floods back to back following 2009, two more major floods. So in 2010 and 2011, we had, again, peaks that required a massive effort by the citizens of Fargo to hold back the red. And that really got us thinking, we're on a river that has just 100 years of record. What do we really know? If we're calculating our 1% chance flood on 100 years of record, what do we know? And are we planning for something that's big enough if we plan for even our flood of record? So we started to take a look and we realized that around the valley, around North Dakota, places we were familiar with, they had experienced events that were greater than what our flood of record was to us. So in Minot in 2011, a 450-year event. Grand Forks in 1997, something greater than a 250-year event. So we wondered, are we thinking big enough? We are a community of 100,000, 230,000 when you add the metro area together. Is a 100-year level of protection good enough? So the other thing we knew was that the risk wasn't really defined for us yet. We had a floodplain at 38.5 feet. The hydrology for that floodplain came from roughly the 1970s. Following the 1997 flood, there was a remap that occurred. That remapping process, they used the same hydrology, the 29,300 cubic feet per second, and they applied that to new river cross sections and new topography and said, guess what? It looks like the floodplain is actually going to go up a foot for you. Again, same flow, more information about our system, and the water surface elevation increased a foot. So in Fargo and Moorhead, we had different impacts from that variation of a foot. Moorhead was a little bit quicker on the draw. They adopted that map quicker than Fargo did. So in 2012, they had a new FEMA floodplain. Prior to 2012, they had 256 structures that were impacted at 38.5 feet. In Fargo, we had roughly 475 structures impacted. With the remap and the move up 1 foot, Fargo now came into the realm of about 2,300 properties impacted. Moorhead, their numbers went down. They went down to 178, but they went down due to the buyout of a number of properties that otherwise would have been impacted. In Fargo, we purchased 197 properties between 2009 and this year, and that is not enough to create a measurable impact like you see in Moorhead. With 197 properties purchased, the magnitude and the scale of having 2,300, it just doesn't make a big enough dent to continue to acquire those properties. So what else do we know? We started looking at our hydrology in the period of record and working with the Corps of Engineers, and the Corps of Engineers said, when we take into account more recent flood events up through 2011, we really should be talking about something closer to 41 feet in the Red River Valley, at Fargo, at Moorhead. And when you take into account that elevation, you're talking about 820 impacted structures on the Moorhead side and 11,000 primary structures on the North Dakota side. And so, just looking at Fargo, 11,000 impacted homes. We've had a lot of turmoil, I'll say, in the world of flood insurance in the last few years with bigger waters and the Homeowners Flood Insurance Affordability Act. And we've seen premiums move for our residents. And so on the average, 11,000 homes, an annual premium of $3,000 to $5,000 per home. We were talking about $30 to $50 million a year leaving our community. Not going to provide flood protection, not increasing our readiness for an event, but leaving our community. And that was a concern. So at this point, we came to the conclusion that when you're trying to pick the right project, trying to right-size the project, we really needed to be looking at more than a 100-year level of protection for the size of the community that we are. And that was in line with what the Red River Basin Commission had been telling us. We found these things out through the long-term flood solution goals that this organization set. So 500-year level of protection is recommended for large metro areas, and only Winnipeg meets that criteria today. Bigger floods have happened, Minot and Grand Forks. We felt it was necessary for our project to set the goals of 100-year flood protection with the ability to fight larger flood events. So once we made that decision, it was really clear that we had to have partners. We worked very closely. We engaged leaders on both sides of the river, both in North Dakota and Minnesota. And we also brought the Corps to the table. What does the Corps offer? Well, the Corps has a lot to offer. They helped us wade through a number of alternatives. We looked at a no-action alternative. We looked at non-structural alternatives, such as elevating homes, such as restoring wetlands to try and provide flood capacity during an event that could reduce our peak. We looked at the building of levees and floodwalls. We looked at diversion channels, upstream storage and retention. And in the end, it was determined that in order to be effective, we were going to need a combination of those alternatives to meet our goals. The other strengths that the Corps brought to the table, they brought a cost share, which was really important because the anticipated costs of this project were pretty epic. We're talking about a $2.2 billion project today. At that time, we didn't have that number, but we knew it was going to be substantial. And the Corps also brought technical expertise. These are the numerous alternatives that have been evaluated. Another way to look at the various alternatives here with this graphic, I have to stop and look at it and say it's so cute. I won't take you through all of these alternatives, but I do want you to know that they all have stacks of technical data. There's models, there's drawings, and there's reports behind each of these alternatives. I do want to focus on just a couple of the alternatives that we did look at. One of those being a levee alternative. This is a levee alternative, and what we learned was on the North Dakota side, there's no high ground to tie into. So if you're talking about building levee protection for the city of Fargo, you are talking at something less than a 50-year level of protection. We have built over $300 million in flood protection locally, $200 million on the North Dakota side, $100 million on the Minnesota side. And again, if we continue to do that and spent a total of $900 million between the two cities, we would be at less than a 50-year level of protection. We also know that building those levees would have upstream impacts, and the cost of mitigating those upstream impacts is not included in the calculation, the $900 million. We do not obtain certification, and so flood insurance premiums still leave our community. We also looked at distributed storage. This diversion project is upstream retention. It is upstream retention directly upstream of Fargo and Moorhead. It is providing 150,000 acre-feet of upstream retention. Through numerous analyses, we determined that if we had 270,000 acre-feet of storage spread throughout the basin, we would accomplish about a 2-foot reduction on our 100-year level. So again, that would not provide certification for Fargo, that would not take anybody out of the floodplain, and it would not help us fight a flood event that was larger than a 100-year event. So distributed storage alone was ruled out. It cannot provide the levels of protection that we need. We looked at what has worked in the valley. So in Manitoba, you just heard from Steve Topping, what a wonderful presentation. All I can say is we're jealous, and we look forward to a time when we can provide information to you on how our project operates. I won't go through these details because, again, you did just hear from Steve on how their project operates and how it has worked for them. So we began now understanding what we needed to include, a diversion and levees and storage. We began the process of studying those alternatives in depth. Between 2008 and 2011, a federal feasibility was conducted, and then following that feasibility study, there were some post-feasibility modifications to the project, and that resulted in a supplemental environmental assessment in 2013. Again, the project purpose at this point is to provide 100-year protection and to give us the chance to flood fight against something greater than 100-year. That federal NEPA process did something really important. It brought the public to the table. There were numerous meetings. We received a lot of public comment, and each level of public comment shaped the design and helped us to modify the project to become what it is today, which we think is, again, the right project. Through that process, numerous impacts, numerous elements were evaluated. We looked at impacts, level of protection, costs, infrastructure, homes, damages prevented, flood insurance. All of these things factored into the decision-making at each step in the process. One of the major changes, you heard Steve refer to the fact that we have downstream impacts. Well, I'm proud to correct that statement and let you know that we do not have downstream impacts. By providing retention directly upstream of Fargo and Moorhead, we are able to eliminate the downstream impacts that were anticipated. We store that water and we release it in a manner that allows us to not have downstream impacts. So this plan reduced the original design impacts by over 2 feet. There were about 4,500 structures that would have been impacted downstream had we continued without the storage element, and we were able to reduce that number as well. I need to point out that other alignments were considered. The Minnesota alignment that was considered would have required a staging area if the design had been taken to a higher level of design, such as the North Dakota alternative did. So again, we're still in that period between 2008 and 2011, and we're conducting some other improvements to the project. These other improvements came about in that 2012 timeframe. So value engineering studies were conducted, and we looked at multiple things through the value engineering. The southern alignment of the project, is it in the right place? Can we provide for more flow through town and reduce the impacts in that upstream staging area? Are there ways that we can change our operation through adding weirs, or gates versus weirs? And can we provide ring levee protection to some of the impacted areas south of us? We also looked at multiple channel alignments through that process. This is an example of, again, the southern alignments that were considered. An option that went north of the wild rice, very reminiscent of Southside flood control. VE13C, the yellow alignment, VE13A, the red alignment, and then you can see there the feasibility study alignment, and even one that was considered that went south of Oxbow to try to prevent having to build that ring levee around Oxbow. The decision on the alignment was made for technical reasons. We wanted not to conflict with the Cheyenne diversion, which is in place. We wanted to provide protection to the city of Horace. And we really needed to minimize the length, and ultimately that meant the cost of the southern embankment that was being constructed. And it was very, very important to us to try to provide the least impact to people and structures as well. Another modification that occurred was allowing more flow through town. So right out in front of City Hall, the street, you've seen it, it's been presented in multiple pictures here in this very conference, floods at a stage of 30. And so our original goal was to try to keep that street from flooding and try to get below 30 feet through town during a flood. Well, we learned that through the combination of building some projects in town, we could push more flow through town, stage less water, operate a little less frequently, and change the impacts to that area to the south of us. And so that was incorporated into the project, and this past year, we've completed about $60 million worth of in-town improvements that are all geared toward allowing that 35 feet to flow through town. And you got to see Randy talk a little bit about that yesterday if you were here. We've continued to make significant efforts in town, both in Fargo and Moorhead. 700 homes have been acquired. Fargo has completed over 200 million in town levies, and Moorhead 100 million. I need to point out that all of that work does not maintain its accreditation if the floodplain elevation raises. All of those areas that are currently protected by those levees will be brought back into the floodplain. The DNR did complete its own study. The members of the Diversion Authority worked very closely with the state of Minnesota to provide information. So what that study determined is that it included 3 separate screenings of alternatives to the alternatives that we had screened, and it did not result in the identification of any additional reasonable alternatives to the project. That study did receive its Determination of Adequacy in June of 2016. You're going to hear from Commissioner Landwehr on the permitting process a little bit later, so I will get into that. The federal project. Here we are. This is where we're at. This is the design that we are working from today. It was included in the Water Resources Development Act in June of 2014. The diversion is one of 26 projects that has been authorized. We received appropriations in 2016 and a new start in 2016. Another major milestone was the signing of a project partnership agreement with the Corps of Engineers. And at this point, we're looking forward to a project. This is the FM area without a project, with the increase in the floodplain. And this is with the project. So once again, we do feel very strongly that we have arrived at the appropriate project for this community. We are protecting 230,000 lives, 150,000 jobs, 19 billion in property value, 5.5 billion in wages, and about 3.5 billion in annual sales. Again, this is not Diversion 101, so if you would like to know more about the project, I would encourage you to visit our booth or to talk to any of the folks who are here who represent the diversion. I do want to close with, you can see that we looked at many alternatives, and it was not our intention to become visionaries. It was not our intention to create a grand project. We allowed the process of problem solving to help us to evolve into the right project and the project that provides protection to our community. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, April, for that extremely informative presentation. I'm going to request that we hold questions until all of the panelists have spoken, and then we can engage in a Q&A after that. And with that, I will invite Colonel Calkins from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to make a presentation at his role.
Thank you very much, Hank. I don't have any slides. I'd like to start by saying this is the first time I've been to the Red River Basin Commission meeting. I've only been in the job in St. Paul for about 6 months, so I will be the first to admit that I'm new to this. The people who've been with this commission for 34 years and fighting floods that we heard about yesterday since 1997, and of course well before that, know a whole lot more about this than I do. But I do have some perspectives that I think are helpful to the discussion here. I'd like to thank the RRBC for putting together a great event here. I think starting with Dr. Davenport's presentation yesterday on the social science behind water resource projects, if I got that right, really reminding us all that the emotional impacts of the projects and the things that we're doing are important and are real, and that we have to think about those. To the presentations on remembering the 1997 flood, really, we hope that we don't have to have another flood in order to justify the flood mitigation projects that we're doing. And I think that helps us all remember, those of us who weren't here for those flood fights, hearing about the real dangerous, difficult work that people did and committed weeks of their lives to saving the cities that they lived in. That was very powerful. And I thought Steve Tompkins' presentation earlier this morning on the Winnipeg channel was also very appropriate. Talked a lot about the similarities and differences between this Fargo Moorhead project and the Winnipeg project. I learned a lot from that as well, especially his comments on mitigation. And I'll talk a little bit about that more. And this is all just my preamble to get to the point here. I've got some more preamble though. So thanks to the RRBC. Who's up on stage here? We have a federal project here, but really it depends on the local sponsors, the state governments, 2 states involved here, of course, and the federal government as well. So the state of North Dakota isn't represented up here, but we've worked very closely with the State Water Commission and others in the state and appreciate their cooperation, and of course couldn't do the project without them. The local sponsors, the Diversion Authority, I think I can probably say this without exaggerating, in the 241-year history of the Corps, there's never been a better local sponsor. So that was a joke, because I can't really say that without exaggerating, but they're awesome. So every Corps project, with rare exceptions of navigation projects, has a local sponsor. So we never do anything on our own. And this sponsor has really been great. April probably didn't take enough credit for what the vision and the new way of looking at things that the Diversion Authority has brought to this effort. So I'd like to thank them. And I'm going to let you down here, but for those of you who are hoping to see me throw down the gauntlet and challenge the Commissioner of the Minnesota DNR, Tom Landwehr, to a duel, that's not going to happen. This isn't going to be a great debate. We've traded jabs in the press and so on and so forth. But the reality of it is we couldn't do this without the state of Minnesota as well. We have our differences. There's a lawsuit pending. That's one of the ways in this great country that we solve problems, is through the court. So, that's maybe a setback for the project, but in the scheme of things, I think it's just one other thing that we can deal with and work our way through to provide this project. So, the commissioner might think differently than me, but we're not here to argue. We're here to solve problems. And so it's a pleasure to be here. I'll say that when I first came into the job 6 months ago, I met my staff and met the important players. But literally the first person outside of the St. Paul district that I went to visit was Commissioner Landwehr. And that is because the relationship between the Corps and the states is very important. I went and met, I think his title is Commissioner, but Mr. Eberly at the North Dakota State Water Commission as well, because that's an equally important relationship. We work on lots of projects in both states, from Roseau down to Breckenridge and Wahpeton and Minot and into the headwaters of the Mississippi. So this is one project in our relationship. It's an important one. It's an expensive one. It's one that has lots of impacts, but it is one of many. So I think all of the players here have a great working relationship. So some people might think that the Corps of Engineers is a juggernaut, and you can like what we're doing or you can hate what we're doing, but you better get out of the way because we're going to do it. That's not true. even if we wanted it to be true, I don't want it to be true. The Corps of Engineers doesn't take that position. But we have laws and regulations like every other federal agency that we follow. Another criticism might be that we take forever to get something done. This is going to be a 20-year project, and darn it, haven't you seen what these floods can do, and why aren't you moving faster? But that sort of falls back to that first question as well. We're not a juggernaut that can do whatever we want to do. There are processes that we have to work through with the states, with the local, with Congress to get funding and so on and so forth. So I'm drawn to the end of my preamble here. This past year, we've had a lot of milestones on the project from the federal perspective. We were approved as one of the 6 new starts for the country, got funding for the project. The states completed their environmental impact statements, which allowed our Assistant Secretary of the Army for Civil Works, Ms. Joellen Darcy, to sign the Project Partnership Agreement, or PPA, in July, which allowed us to officially start moving forward with the contracting and construction process. That same day that the Assistant Secretary signed the PPA, and for those of you who were there, it wasn't really her, it was her deputy, because she had a family emergency at the time. But when he signed that document, that same day we sent out our request for proposals for the first contract, and we awarded that contract in December. We expect groundbreaking to be in April. All right, so what do I really want to say about the project? And there are 3 things that I'd like you to take away. For anybody who was here last night at the Diversion Social at 7 o'clock, the same 3 takeaways, but that's 1, that this project is necessary. 2, that the project in its current form is the one that we're committed to. And 3, we're moving ahead with the project. So why is it needed? A lot of people have said it in more eloquent words than I will right now. But to protect a city of 200, or a region of 230,000 people, and all the economic engine that provides for both Minnesota and North Dakota is important. People shouldn't have to go to the Fargo Dome, bring their whole family, as Steve Topping was saying, men, women, and children, to man the dikes and fill the sandbags. Somebody who was there yesterday, Thatch, who sat in the audience, was telling me that it was absolutely amazing that nobody got killed in that, just in the Fargo Dome. There was heavy equipment, there were sandbags, there were children and men and women working. And it was literally amazing to him. He's an Army veteran of 30 years and has seen lots of dangerous things. He said that was one of the most dangerous things he had seen. So we shouldn't have to do that as a matter of course. We have the resources, we have the skills and the expertise to put in place permanent flood protection. So we need the project. The project in its current form, April again talked on that, so I won't dwell on it, but over the past 8 to 10 years, we've looked at countless different ways of approaching the project. There was a diversion channel through Minnesota that didn't work. There was a diversion channel through North Dakota that would have caused downstream impacts without the embankment. There are in-town levees. We've looked at all of that, and what we've arrived at is that to achieve certifiable 100-year protection, the project is in its current form is what we need. That's an embankment to the south for retention and a diversion channel to pass the flows north. Why 100-year protection? Well, that's what FEMA sees as certifiable protection. The Red River Basin Commission, as April pointed out, recommends 500-year protection. Well, if we get to that 100-year level, we can flood fight, or the community here can flood fight up to the 500-year level. We've vetted the project through both states, through the Corps of Engineers, through independent technical reviews, through extensive periods of public comment along the way, and nobody has been able to come up with a project that provides certifiable 100-year protection with as few impacts as this project has. So there are impacts. People are negatively affected by this project, and I don't mean to gloss over that fact. Going back to Dr. Davenport's presentation, the emotional impacts are real. How do you mitigate for emotional impacts? Well, part of the way to do it is through communication. So that's hopefully what we're doing here today. Not getting into specifics, so please engage me, engage the Diversion Authority people. Ask us what our plan for mitigation is, because there are lots of plans and there's lots of money set aside for mitigation. So how do you mitigate emotionally? Well, you communicate with people. And then you mitigate physically, which hopefully helps cure some of those emotional wounds. But there's, again, plans and money set aside for that. We're open to ideas on how to make this project better, but we're not open to the idea of kind of starting over and coming up with a completely different plan. And the final point I want to make is that we are moving forward. I've already mentioned that we awarded our first contract. We're continuing the design of the wild rice inlets and the Red River Inlet. We think those will be ready for awarding for construction probably in early 2018. We've got some mitigation projects, the drain dam and the wild rice dam, that we hope we can award this year if we get some funding for those. Again, we've been working on this project for the past 8 years at least. We're optimistic that we can build it in the next 8.5 years. Delaying the project by a year or 2 years or whatever it might be would only make the possibility of flooding more real in the 1 or 2 years that we delay. So I don't think it's in the public interest. We're taking some measured risks, but we are moving forward with the project. And that's what we intend to do. So I look forward, I hope, to getting some good questions after this, and more importantly, in the hallways and in the conference rooms for the rest of the week, to talking to all of you, anyone who has questions or concerns with the way the Corps is approaching this project, please come talk to me. I look forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Colonel Calkins, for those comments and that perspective. That's very helpful. And without further ado, Commissioner Tom Landwehr from the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me here today. I apologize for not having been to a River Basin Commission previously. It's certainly an exceptional organization in terms of the work that you do trying to coordinate things in a river basin and deal with the many problems we have, and I appreciate the invitation to be here today. You know, I want to say first and foremost that this is not a question of whether or not there's a need for flood protection, whether there are damages or whether there are threats by flooding. We all get that. Minnesota's invested hundreds of millions of dollars to deal with flood damages and protect citizens from the impacts of floods. The question is before the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources is this specific project permittable under state law? And as you all know, we have said no, it is not. What I want to do is walk through a little bit of how we got here, what Minnesota's role has been at the state level in this project, what our decision-making process has been, and how I think we go forward from here. For those of you that don't know, perhaps our Canadian partners in particular, the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources is responsible for a number of areas of public resources. So the things that the people of Minnesota own in concert, things like state forests, we have 4 million acres of state forests, things like state parks, we have 75 state park and recreation areas, fish and wildlife, and water. Water is one of those things that is a public resource, and the State Department of Natural Resources has the authority to manage water quantity. So when water is pumped from the ground, we issue water appropriation permits. When water is taken out of a river, we issue water appropriation permits. When dams are constructed, we are responsible for permits. So there are 3 areas that are the authority of the Department of Natural Resources that really relate to this project. And the first is environmental review. So Minnesota has got some very, very strong environmental protections, and anybody who lives in Minnesota knows this. In fact, the most recent example, I think, of that has been the 2008, we had a legacy amendment. We had a constitutional amendment that dedicated 3/8% of taxes, new taxes, to conservation of the environment, both clean water, the environment, parks and trails, and arts and culture. $300 million a year tax that Minnesotans voted overwhelmingly to support. And this was in 2008 when we were having a financial meltdown. The mortgage crisis was going on, and people were feeling really bad. Minnesotans who care so much about the environment still voted to tax themselves more. We've got an extraordinary level of environmental protections, both in the environmental impact statement process. We've got what's called the Minnesota Environmental Rights Act. It mirrors the federal Minnesota National Environmental Policy Act. Very, very strong environmental protections in place. We've got 2 wetland protection laws, the Protected Waters Inventory Act of the 1980s and the Wetland Conservation Act of 2011. So Minnesotans take this seriously. And the reason I mention that is because those authorities are passed by the legislature that come down the state of Minnesota. So we have environmental review. we are required by law to look at the impacts of major projects and evaluate what those impacts are going to be, what potential mitigations might be offered to deal with those impacts. We have the flood damage reduction program under the state of Minnesota, Department of Natural Resources. As I mentioned, the state has already put out hundreds of millions of dollars. I think it's close to $230 million is what has come through the Department of Natural Resources to do flood control projects with all of our partner units of government across the state. And I'm told by the man who administers that program that by virtue of the state's investments, we're within $30 to $50 million of protecting the Minnesota side from the 100-year flood. So we've invested repeatedly year after year after year to protect Minnesota from floods, not just in the Red River, but also Minnesota River, Mississippi River as well. So we have the environmental review, we have the flood damage reduction program, and we also have the permitting program. That's of relevance here today. There are two permits that are required for this project. One is called the Work in Public Waters, and the other is a high hazard dam. We put those permits together for consideration. We look at this project in particular. But those laws were passed, for a couple of reasons. One, work in protected waters. The state has recognized the value of the state's waters, and it's required that people who want to do any work in a public waters, and the Red River qualifies for that, get a permit from the State Department of Natural Resources to show that they are minimizing the damage, they're avoiding the damage, and they're mitigating when the damage is done. The second permit is a high hazard dam. High hazard dam is one of those facilities that, if it fails, could cause major property or life losses. And so the state legislature has required the Department of Natural Resources to evaluate when dams are required to be built, make sure that the minimum dam is constructed, make sure that the damages that the dam causes are less than the benefits that the dam provides, and a number of other things. So those two permits are permits that the Department of Natural Resources is required to administer. The three things come together in that when a major proposal is proposed, like a high hazard dam, we have to go through environmental review process. So what I want to describe is a little bit about what that process has been since I was appointed commissioner in 2011. First off, I want to talk a little bit about the DNR role in the federal EIS process. The federal government is also required to do an EIS process. And that EIS process is a little different in terms of the content of the resulting document versus the state of Minnesota EIS process. And so we have the option at the time that EIS, environmental impact statements, are done to decide whether to do them together or do them apart. And a good example, and Colonel is aware of this as well, of a recent EIS that we did jointly was with respect to a mining project up in north central Minnesota. The Polymelt mine is a large, I'm sure everybody's heard of copper nickel proposed mine. It required both federal and state permits. We joined with the U.S. Forest Service, the Corps of Engineers, and the Department of Natural Resources to go through the EIS process together. And so it takes longer, obviously, than if we just went on our own, or the Corps just went in on their own. But by virtue of going through that process, there are some efficiencies gained, and also we have a lot more coordination. So we can do that. We did not do that in this process. In this process, the Corps and state opted to go separate EIS. So the federal government developed an EIS. And when we, the state, looked at it, we have an opportunity to comment on it, as everybody does. We first observed and discussed that the content does not satisfy state environmental review requirements. And we knew that going into it that we were going to have to do something else. But that was the first thing. There was a number of requirements that the state has for environmental review that weren't achieved by the federal EIS. And so we commented on that and subsequently launched the state EIS. But the alternatives analysis was done in the federal EIS was also based primarily on economic considerations. I don't have that luxury. It's state law and state rules. It says that the environmental impact statement the state does must also consider ecological considerations, and in particular things like geomorphology and impact on wetland ecosystems. And so the state commented on the federal EIS. We had a number of concerns that we expressed in the EIS process, but we also deferred to answering of some of those questions that came up in the federal EIS process to the state EIS process. So the state took on its own environmental impact statement. And I want to make sure people understand that the environmental impact statement is not a decision-making document. It's an informational document. So I often use the analogy that it's like if you're going to go buy a house, you get an engineer's report on it, you get an appraisal on it, you get information on that house that tells you whether or not you want to ultimately buy that house. EIS is just like that. It's informational only. It tells us what the impacts are going to be. It tells us what potential mitigations there might be. In some cases, it does an alternatives analysis, but it does not, at the end of the day, say that it is a good project or a bad project. It just says, here is the project, here's the impacts, here's the proposed mitigation. The adequacy determination, and the Colonel mentioned this, the EIS was determined adequate. Adequacy determination is based on 3 criteria. Was the process that we followed in developing EIS adequate? And yes, it was. Was the scope that was considered in the EIS, did that fulfill the requirements? Yes, it did. And third, did we involve the public? Yes, we did. So the adequacy determination addressed those 3 elements that are in state law. So when we determined that the adequacy, that the EIS was adequate, and that was the commissioner's determination, it just meant that yes, this document has gone through the right process and it answers the questions it originally asked. Again, it's not a green light, it's not a decision-making document. We cited in that document there were several concerns that we had with the proposed project, and we made those publicly known. They were not a secret. We got a lot of comments. The EIS process has 3 places where people can comment on it. One at the very beginning, the EIS, what we call scoping, we ask people what should be in that document. There's things that are required by state law. We also ask the public what should be in there. Secondly, when we get a draft EIS, we ask people, are we missing anything? Is there anything in here wrong? What else should be included? And that public comment period brought some more information to the table that we included in that document. The third is whether or not it's adequate. Public gets to comment on whether or not the EIS is adequate. And so we issued the adequacy determination on the EIS. We could not fundamentally begin a permitting process until that EIS was done. And shortly after the EIS was final and determined adequate, we began to review the permit applications that had been submitted by the Corps and the Diversion Authority. So at that point, now we have a permit and permit application, and now we have to consider the policy and the technical merits of that permit. I say the policy and technical merits. The technical merits are, is this dam, and again, we're relating to the retention dam, which is what required the permit. Is this dam safe? Does it meet technical standards? Does it use the best available engineering? Does it meet all of these technical requirements? Before we could even get to that, we had to ask the question, does this meet state law for policy requirements? And so some of the things that we need to consider are that the Minnesota rules for work in public waters require that the projects be the minimal impact solution to a specific need. 2, the project does not exceed more than a minimum encroachment or change the environment. 3, the adverse effects be subject to practical mitigation measures and be consistent with water and related land management plans and programs for those concerns. So we took the permit application and we carefully evaluated it against those policy issues, because the technical questions don't need to be answered until the policy issues were determined. And the permit was denied for 3 primary reasons, which again are based on statutes. They're not based on whether Tom Landwehr likes or doesn't like this project. They are based on statutes. And I want to reiterate that a couple times, because the Colonel alluded to this, and this is the reality we all get to work in public agencies. My interpretation of the law might be different than somebody else's interpretation of the law, but I have to act on my interpretation, my council's interpretation on what the law says and what we must do as a result of that. When there is disagreement, the way this is resolved, and this is just our democratic form of government, is we go to court. And I don't like to go to court. Colonel doesn't like to go to court. Diversion Authority doesn't like to go to court. But sometimes when there are disagreements about what the law says, this is what we have to do. And so when we issued our permit denial, it was based on these 3 reasons. 1, we believe that the permit, the project did not meet the requirement to be reasonable, practical, protect public safety, and promote public welfare, which is cited in Minnesota Statutes 103G.315. 55% of the land removed from the floodplain within benefited areas is a sparsely developed rural area south of Fargo. The cities both have substantial flood damage, flood protection in place, and the analysis indicated that the developed areas could achieve protection, substantial protection, with the flood damage reduction measures in place, as well as some of those planned, and meet the protection requirements without having a large, massive project as proposed. So it did not, the proposal, the project did not meet the requirement to be the most reasonable, practical, public, protect public safety, promote public welfare with the minimal possible impact. The plan, the second reason, the plan is not consistent with existing floodplain management policies in place by other units of government. Minnesota's got a very rigorous floodplain management law and policy, and for those who understand floods, and you all do, the basis of it is that floodplains need to be protected as floodplains. We should not be building in floodplains. We should not be walling off floodplains because they are the buffer for floods. And so when we build in floodplains, when we wall floodplains off, we increase the impact somewhere else, and we remove that natural buffering ability of floodplains. That is built in Minnesota state law. And the law that required, the framework for the law that we use, we analyze the permit for consistency with state law, says that we must make sure that that project meets floodplain management rules and laws for not just the state of Minnesota, but for other units of government. And so in analyzing the permit application, we concluded that the concerns of the upstream communities were not met and were not likely to be met. And that the project was inconsistent with portions of land use and water management plans of several local units of government, including Clay County, Wilkin County, Buffalo River Watershed District, and even the city of Fargo. So we can't issue a permit if the project is not consistent with other land use and water management policies in place. The project was inconsistent and contrary to Minnesota policy and goals related to floodplain management, as I mentioned earlier. That's Minnesota Statutes 103A, 103F. Among the inconsistencies, the state policy, the policy of the state of Minnesota in statute is to promote water retention and conservation on the land where the precipitation falls. In other words, keep the water up on the ground where it falls as much as possible, and taking out large portions of floodplain and pushing that water somewhere else is inconsistent with that policy. The state policy is to reduce flood damage first through floodplain management and non-structural measures such as floodplain zoning, flood proofing, and flood warning. Again, inconsistent with the project. Maintaining those areas as natural floodplains is part of Minnesota state law. And structural flood control projects like this are to be part of and consistent with floodplain management plans, both in Minnesota statutes 103F.115. Also requires that floodplain projects be considered only as an element of floodplain management adopted by state and local units of government. So the bottom line is that in evaluating the project against those policies, it was determined that the project was not consistent with those policies in the first place. We did not even need to go to the technical merits of whether or not the dam was engineered in the appropriate way. Finally, and this is something that perhaps is addressable, the proposed project did not address all of the mitigation requirements. Mitigation means a lot of things, but in this case, there are land impacts. As many of you know, there are impacts on lands that are currently flooded, will be flooded. How are those landowners going to be compensated? Impacts on cemeteries, impacts on roads, impacts on natural features. And some of these impacts were anticipated to be severe and irreversible. The mitigation plan does not address the impacts of all property and all property interests, and the permit applicant had not estimated all the costs of the proposed mitigation and has not provided a comprehensive plan to fund mitigation. So a lot of these things where we will deal with this in the future as the issue arises, state law requires that those be identified up front. So for those reasons, those were all policy reasons. When we did the review of the permit application, we concluded we could not issue the permit for the project because it did not meet those requirements. after that denial, and as you all know, just in the last 2 weeks, the department filed to intervene with the JPA, the Upstream Coalition, in their lawsuit to appeal the actions of the court to proceed with the project. Under Minnesota state law, if you are required to have a permit, you can't begin a project until you have that permit in hand. And it is our assertion that the project is a local project. The project partnership agreement, and some of you have seen it, asserts that the owner and the manager of the diversion structure will be the diversion authority. It does not say the Corps of Engineers will be the diversion authority. The project is, in our estimation, a local project subject to state Minnesota laws. And when we see the Corps of Engineers proceeding with their letting of contracts, and understand why the Colonel is doing it, they get money, they have certain deadlines, they have to get it out the door by. But when they go down that road, it's in violation of Minnesota's laws. And so we felt compelled to intervene in that lawsuit because that was a relevant vehicle. And because if we did not take action at this point in time, we sort of abrogate our ability to intervene at a later date. In fact, when we filed to intervene, the Diversion Authority contested that and said it was not a timely intervention, we should have intervened before. Our position was, well, we couldn't make this claim until we had gone to the EIS, until we had actually denied the permit. Only at that time could we file a petition to intervene. And so we have done what we believe is a timely intervention, and the court just recently agreed with us. So we are intervening for several reasons. One is that the JPA is seeking to bar construction until the DNR issues the relevant permit. That's our primary concern. We don't want the project to be initiated without having assurance of a permit. And I'll tell you just a practical reason for that is that the more project gets built, the harder it is for us to assert an authority to stop that. The JPA suit alleges that the proposed project will damage farmland upstream of Fargo Moorhead. It'll violate Minnesota environmental laws, and it doesn't consider alternatives. Attaining our intervener status, we are not necessarily supporting the JPA's arguments. We are bringing our own arguments to the table. We don't act as the attorney for the JPA. We act as only on our own behalf, but some of the issues are the same. And one primary one is the ongoing construction of the project. Again, if the state permit is truly required for this project, then construction starting before the permit issued is not legal. If the state permit is not required, which I think is an assertion by some, then the project can start construction. And this is a question, this is a fundamental question of this lawsuit. Is the state permit required? And so that's why we have intervened in this case at this point in time. If we do not intervene right now, we believe we lose our ability to intervene later. So I just want to close by saying, again, flood protection is essential. Flood damages are not acceptable. We need to find a solution to deal with the flood damages. So we've already begun discussions with the Diversion Authority and the Corps of Engineers to figure out how can we move forward with flood protection. I don't think, frankly, that it's possible to have a candid and open and authentic discussion until we have resolved the issue about the current project. And so while we're having these discussions, we have to acknowledge that there's an 800-pound gorilla in the room, and how honest of a discussion can we have until that gorilla goes out the door. But we remain open and willing, and we've already begun those discussions to talk with the Diversion Authority, to talk with the Corps of Engineers, but I think importantly to talk with multiple interests on a river about the needed flood protection and how we can get to the table to agree on something that is going to provide the most benefit with a minimum negative impact. And so that's why Minnesota is where we are. And at this point, I'm going to turn it back to our moderator, who's going to take questions.
Very good. Thank you very much, Commissioner Landwehr. Okay, so very good. Thank you, Jeff. So we do have time for questions, and I'd like to provide a little bit of context. This is obviously a complex discussion, and we can't resolve everything here. This is a time where we can ask questions for clarification. And I would urge all audience members to maintain that goal, to seek points of clarification and short points of information. All of the panelists have agreed to receive longer points of information in the corridors over lunch. They'll be here for the rest of the conference. So longer expositions, if you will, should be limited to the corridors and other venues. But we can ask questions of clarification, and that's what I invite all of you to do at this moment. So I'll turn it over to the audience members and invite those questions at this time. The mic is positioned in the center of the room, at the back center of the room. Okay,
well, that was easy.
Yeah. So does anyone have a short snapper to get us started here?
Ice fishing is slow on Lake of the Woods. Anybody want to talk about Mille Lacs, Polymet? Anything else?
So I see
A brave soul has arisen.
brave soul has
Has to go to the bathroom? Yeah.
Mike's at the back of the room. Excellent.
I just had a quick question, and maybe it's not a quick answer, but does the state of Minnesota believe that the project could go forward in its present form, but just needs to dot more I's and cross more T's, or and had more information or more impact? I mean,
No. Bottom line is no. The project as proposed is not permittable for reasons I mentioned, and so it will require some, I don't know, I can't say what level, major, minor, significant changes, but as it's currently proposed, it's not permittable. The Vikings are better than the Packers.
It's a point of convergence, a point of consensus, isn't it?
Commissioner Landwehr, you stated you believe that the area could obtain substantial flood protection in something other than this project. Is substantial flood protection synonymous with 100-year certifiable flood protection?
I think clearly the goal of both the states as well as the local agencies of government is 100-year flood protection. I mean, without that, then we're not getting the flood protection we need. There's sort of two issues around that. One is how do we protect life and property? What's the right level of protection for life and property? The other is how do you get certification for insurance? And I think we lump those together. I think we have to be conscious that they have different implications. And I'm not an engineer. I'm not here to talk about the engineering designs and what's needed, but I think we have to be conscious that, our foremost concern is protecting life and property. Certification is a secondary issue, but they're tied together.
Any other questions at this time?
Just addressing the conflict in terms of the state of Minnesota and the Corps of Engineers. I'm just curious. I appreciate what the commissioner said in terms of perhaps being handcuffed by the legislation and considering that it is illegal and not permissible. But I'm just curious as to what, if any, views have been expressed by the politicians as to the need for the project and whether or not it should go through. Is that consistent with what the commissioner's expressing, and is it just sort of a technical response and reasoning behind not allowing the project to go through?
You know, great question. One that kind of comes up a lot is how much does the lobbying, the petitioning, the opinions of individual legislators weigh into sort of the executive branch. And you know, I've been in this job for 6 years now. Believe me, I can't think of any easy issues we have. We have a lot of issues. We have 201 legislators with their own opinions. I've come to the personal position that, you know, I will listen to individual legislators, I will listen to individual politicians, but in order for me to move, I need all 201 of them to make a position. And right now, that position is what's on the state statutes. And so, you know, one of the ways this could be resolved is if the Minnesota legislature says, hey, what, you know what, Fargo diversion is exempt from state laws. Then, you know, again, the Commissioner's Handbook is state laws, I'll follow state laws, but one or two legislators come up to me and says, I think you should do this, I think you should do that. I just say, thanks for the input. Here's the Commissioner's Handbook, it's Minnesota statutes. And I should mention as well that so many things these days end up in litigation. I mentioned Mille Lacs, I mentioned Polymet. You know, I can talk about half a different areas where we've got litigation ongoing, and it's largely as a result of that. It's what is the right interpretation of law, and it's not that again there are opinions that are we're making decisions based on opinions. We're making decisions based on law, and when people disagree about interpretation of law, then we go back to court.
I'd just like to say a couple quick things while we wait for the next question, so nobody's leaving until 11:30. Let me start with the questions. So the question of whether this is a federal project comes up frequently, and the answer is emphatically yes, it is a federal project. The commissioner mentioned that the Diversion Authority will operate and maintain the project in accordance with the project partnership agreement after it's completed. If that was the standard by which you measured a federal project, there would be almost zero federal projects in the country, because the standard practice is to hand those over to local communities to operate and maintain. So that's not something unique to this project. And I personally don't think, and I guess the courts will decide if that makes this not a federal project, but to be absolutely clear, I surely think it is. Just one other quick note, the question of whether we should proceed while the lawsuit is ongoing. As the commissioner said, maybe we should wait for the gorilla to leave the room. Okay, the problem with that is that as great as our court system is in a lot of ways, probably nobody ever complimented it for being quick. So the question is, should we wait another 6 months, 2 years, 5 years, whatever it's going to be to resolve the court cases before we do anything? And again, I think the answer is emphatically no. Every year we delay is another year that there could be a devastating flood in the Fargo Moorhead area. Are we taking a little risk? Could the judge say, Corey, you can't build this project? I guess they probably could. But we're taking the calculated risk of moving forward while litigation goes on for that reason.
Thank you for those clarifying comments, Colonel Calkins. Any other comments, questions at this time?
To begin with, I'd like to thank April and the Colonel and Tom for an excellent presentation. I really enjoyed it. I've been following this project for years, but I even learned a few more things today, so that's always a good thing. I guess it's true that you never quit learning. April, you made a comment that I'd like to have just a little bit of clarification on. You said that the upstream storage area has eliminated downstream impacts. I'm under the understanding that there still will be some downstream impacts, just that they've been minimalized to the point where they're no longer required to be basically reported on under federal and state laws, but there still are some minimal downstream impacts. Is that true?
I want to defer that to Greg Gilman, who's right here, if you don't mind. He's
Go right ahead.
he's involved in the modeling, involved in the project. So.
All right, thanks, April. Obviously, with a complicated river system like the Red River, anytime you add more detail to the model, it can change the results, but essentially the results go to zero and stay at zero throughout the extent of the model. We've modeled a range of flood events, the 10-year all the way up through the 500-year, and the intent is to mitigate those impacts through all of those events. So. Obviously, you have accuracy in your models. You can debate what is actual zero, but compared to any other modeling or projects that's been done, it takes them to zero.
All right, thank you.
Well, we have the option of dismissing early, I suppose, and that's perhaps a good thing. That means that this forum has been edifying, which is very, very important and the goal. Noting no further comments or questions, I think we will close the session.
We'll stand right up here for a while so people want to come up and ask questions.
Very good. So the comment from the commissioner is that the panelists will remain on the podium to speak with you individually. So I want to thank the panelists and the Red River Basin Commission. I believe this has been very helpful, certainly for many of us who were not exposed to this project. So thank you again. Thank you.